Welcome back. In this class, we're going to talk about hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons typically come up in question 6 on the exam paper and are usually worth between 6 and 12 marks. It's a common definition, what is a hydrocarbon, but leading off of that, you could also be asked to explain whether something is considered saturated or unsaturated in the types of hydrocarbon. So there's quite a bit here that we're going to break down. So up first, the definition for what a hydrocarbon is. It's a compound that contains only carbon and hydrogen atoms. Now, that word only is very important because it's not enough for you to say that a hydrocarbon contains carbon and hydrogen. It does, but it only contains those two elements. So for example, if I draw on the board over here, a very common hydrocarbon that you're going to see over the next few weeks is this. This is called ethane. Ethane is an alkane and it's C2H6. Now with ethane, it is considered a hydrocarbon because this molecule only contains carbon and hydrogen atoms. If I was to do this, where I take one of the hydrogens off and now I replace it with this. This is called ethanol. It's the alcohol that's found in alcoholic drinks and solvents. Now, this compound is not considered a hydrocarbon because it has an atom of an element in here that's not carbon or hydrogen. Yes, the molecule does contain carbon. Yes, it contains hydrogen, but it has something other than those two elements. It has oxygen, so it can't be considered a hydrocarbon. When you're giving your definition for what a hydrocarbon is, it has to be clear from your definition that it can only have two elements, carbon and hydrogen, and nothing else. So the word only must be in your definition or it's going to end up costing you 3 marks if it's not there. Other hydrocarbons could be this. So we did ethane there a second ago. Another one would be this, which is called ethene. Okay. It contains only carbon and hydrogen, so it is a hydrocarbon, but now compared to the one that you just saw, the bonding between the two carbon atoms is different. The first one had a single bond between the two carbon atoms, and now this one has a double bond. That leads to this idea of different types of hydrocarbons, and there's 2 names that you have to remember here. The first one is a saturated hydrocarbon. Now, the definition for what a saturated hydrocarbon is, it is a hydrocarbon that contains all carbon-carbon single bonds. So again, the idea that it can only have single bonds, carbon-carbon single bonds only. Now that word only, again, is quite important. So the idea that you're getting across here is no matter how long the carbon chain is, that you only have single bonds between the carbon atoms. There is no multiple bonds like a double or a triple bond. Now for something like this, it has come up in recent years where students were asked, explain why this is saturated. And people said, well, it contains single bonds. Yes, but it is only single bonds. And I'll show you the distinction between that now in a second. So if I was drawing a saturated hydrocarbon, I have a carbon backbone and you have single bonds between all of the carbon atoms like that. This molecule has 5 carbon atoms and it's an alkane. So the name of this compound is pentane, and we'll learn how to name the compounds in a little bit when we do the UPAC naming. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pentane. Now, to identify that it's a saturated hydrocarbon, you highlight just the carbon backbone and you look at the bonding between the carbons. They are all single bonds, therefore it's saturated. Now the other one is an unsaturated hydrocarbon. Unsaturated hydrocarbons contain multiple bonds. So they contain carbon-carbon, double or triple bonds. Now here, if you have a long chain hydrocarbon and you're asked to distinguish whether it's saturated versus unsaturated, it can have loads and loads and loads of single bonds in the carbon chain. However, if that molecule has even one double or triple bond between the carbons, then it's considered an unsaturated hydrocarbon. So the presence of just one multiple bond will make the molecule unsaturated. So an example, if I draw this molecule here. Okay, this molecule is pent-2-ene, or 2-pentene if you prefer. We'll see the UPAC naming later. So we highlight the carbon backbone in this molecule and we look at the individual bonds between the carbon atoms. This bond is a single bond, but this one here is a double bond. The fact that you have even one double bond in this entire molecule between the carbon atoms, that means this is an unsaturated molecule. It doesn't matter that there are 3 times as many carbon-carbon single bonds. That doesn't matter. So the presence of one multiple bond will make it unsaturated. Now you might have come across the word saturated versus unsaturated before in terms of fats. A saturated fat is a fat or lipid molecule that has a carbon backbone that contains all carbon-carbon single bonds. Unsaturated fats, that is a fat or a lipid molecule that has double bonds usually between the carbons in the carbon backbone. You might even have come across polyunsaturated fats. That would be a fat molecule or lipid molecule that has loads of carbon-carbon double bonds usually between the carbons in the carbon backbone. So poly means many. Okay, so that's the differentiation between saturated versus unsaturated. Now here, what you need to be able to do is you need to be able to look at a molecule and pick out that molecule is saturated or that molecule is unsaturated for 3 marks. But then you also need to explain why. And that's where your definition comes in to help you. And your definitions are really important, so you have to learn them off here. Because your explanation is you just state the definition and you've got 3 marks for that. So in theory, you can get 6 marks here for explaining whether something is saturated or unsaturated and identifying it. So we're going to have a look at some of the practice questions in your notes. So first up, for each of the following organic compounds, state whether the molecule is saturated or unsaturated. So all you have to do here is be able to look at these molecules and pick out, does it have carbon-carbon single bonds or is there a double or triple bond present? And that will tell you which of the 2 you're dealing with. Now, there's quite a few of them on this page. However, I'm only going to look at 3 of them. So up first, I've got ethene. We look at the carbon backbone. There is a double bond between 2 carbon atoms. That's a multiple bond. Therefore, this molecule, ethene, is an unsaturated hydrocarbon. For writing in unsaturated, you get 3 marks. Now we move on to the next one. Ethane, if we look at the carbon backbone, you have a carbon-carbon single bond between 2 carbon atoms. That is a saturated hydrocarbon. For the word saturated, we get 3 marks. Then we move on. Ethyne, you have a carbon-carbon triple bond. That's a multiple bond. So ethyne is an unsaturated molecule for 3 marks. Now, question 2 in the practice questions, explain your choice of saturated or unsaturated for ethane and ethyne. Now, in your explanation, make your definitions work for you here. So we're going to go for ethane. Why is ethane saturated? Because it contains carbon-carbon single bonds only. Or only carbon-carbon single bonds is fine. Whereas with ethyne, why is ethyne unsaturated in my view? Because it contains a carbon-carbon triple bond. It's a multiple bond between carbon atoms. Now you get 3 marks for each explanation. So 3 marks for your ethane and 3 marks for your ethyne. Now, it is a common question on the exam for 6 marks, and it's a really handy 6 marks in question 6 when it does come up. But make sure you study your definitions. So you have 3 definitions to learn off here. What's a hydrocarbon? It's a compound that contains only carbon and hydrogen atoms. What is a saturated hydrocarbon? It's a hydrocarbon that contains only carbon-carbon single bonds. And the third one, what is an unsaturated hydrocarbon? It's a hydrocarbon that contains a carbon-carbon double or carbon-carbon triple bond. And then outside of that, once you've identified whether your compound is saturated or unsaturated, then you should be able to tell me why you have picked that one. So link it back to your definition.